Joining me right now is Robert George, editorial writer for the New York Daily News, Taylor Maxwell, Deputy Communications Director for Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America, and Republican strategist Brian Darling. It's great to have all of you with me, and I know that we have been watching together all of these different protests that have been taking place around the country. We have the example of what took place today in Boston, and the anti-Nazi protests really dwarfed this small group of right-wingers. But Robert, let me ask you, when we think about the amount of people here in Boston as opposed to what we saw in Charlottesville, how does this compare in terms of police organization, also event organization, for people being able to effectively do what they want and achieve a satisfaction of being heard?
Well, that's the key thing. I mean, I think the worst thing in Charlottesville, obviously, aside from the loss of life down there, was the fact that the police lost control of the situation. They didn't keep the protesters and counter-protesters separate, and we saw what happened. Obviously, up in Boston, they were prepared. Obviously, they'd gotten to see what had happened the week before, and they kept the peace, and that's the most important thing. And I think we can all thank God for that, and the organization of the police officers.
And Brian, we know that President Trump has sent out this series of tweets today, in one of which he says, our great country has been divided for decades. Sometimes you need protest in order to heal, and we will heal and be stronger than ever before. So he also tweeted that he applauds the protesters in Boston about this. But Brian, the thing that's different for Charlottesville, the night before, we had that group streaming down dark streets with tiki torches toward the Confederate monument. And then these are the same folks that show up the very next day. Police had a beat of knowing what their imagery or their intent may be for Saturday. Do you think that people who have witnessed what happened in Charlottesville, and certainly police forces, have an idea of what to expect from the intent of what these groups might do in the future?
I think so. I think the police in Boston learned from what happened in Charlottesville. They kept the two sides apart. They didn't meet. They didn't fight. It looks like there are still some straggler troublemakers in Boston trying to fight with the police. But overall, being against Nazis, being against white supremacists, not a partisan issue, not hard to do. And it really should be easier for our country to come together against extremism on both the right and the left, and to make sure that these people are marginalized where they belong and not taken seriously. And sadly, I think some of these events have given them a platform that they like, and that's unfortunate. But hopefully President Trump, who obviously had a bad week, can move on and maybe move on to policy issues and try and right the ship of the Trump presidency. We
know in Boston there were 27 folks that were detained or arrested. I think right now we're witnessing some live images of police detaining another person. This is when we heard from the police just in the last half hour about the day there in Boston. So out of the thousands of people that showed up, again, the number's not very large for people that they've had to detain or arrest. But let me ask, when we think about the larger imagery here, Taylor, and the fact that in Boston we know that weapons weren't allowed, Virginia was an open carry state situation, and people showed up armed to the teeth. How difficult is this going to be, state to state, where there are different laws and people will show up with different intent and with a right to be there with some type of weapon?
It's a great question, and in the majority of the states, it's perfectly legal to openly carry a firearm without a background check, without a permit, without training. My manicurist has more legal restrictions than your average person trying to open carry in the streets.
Well, so do you think that we're going to have more instances of folks that saw Charlottesville that feel more emboldened by not only the effect and the fear, the intimidation that was caused, but also the media attention that they've gotten because of this?
Well, historically, I can tell you from Moms Demand Action, for example, this has been something that's happened to our volunteers for years now, where we'll hold events, particularly in southern states, and we'll be met with armed extremists who are using the open carry loophole to silence us or to attempt to. So it's a pretty standard practice that is grotesque, and at this point, it's definitely being used to silence marginalized communities and intimidate, and it needs to be stopped.
Meanwhile, we know, you wanted to say, Robert? Go ahead.
I was just going to say, one of the problems we've had, I mean, in Charlottesville, you've got the alt-right people coming in with as a militia, possibly to intimidate. Unfortunately, you also had the so-called Antifa people who come in not with guns but with bricks and bats, and one guy had a blowtorch. So if you're going to like really crack down on weapons, you're going to make sure to say, okay, there's no guns, but you also got to
cover broad bases, because even people were turning their flagpoles into weapons.
Exactly.
And we know, Brian, with Trump heading to Arizona for a rally next week, how do you think, or what would you recommend that the president do to try to clean up the muddied waters he's really created and the chaotic message where he stands with his own party members questioning his moral authority and his competence?
Well, we've seen messages, conflicting messages in the past week where the president has said some things that just don't sound consistent. So he needs to have a strong speech, a consistent speech denouncing the hate mongers and denouncing a lot of the awful things that have happened, and to be clear and to be a strong leader, and also to get back to policy, because the American people want jobs. The American people want tax cuts. They want to see health care reformed. They might want to see an infrastructure bill passed. They want to see Congress do something. And he can lead that fight. He can lead on policy and try and bring the country together, because as we can see, and as we've seen this past week, the American people have lost a little confidence in him. He can step up and get that back if he starts showing moral authority and giving some good speeches showing his moral authority.
But
go ahead, Robert.
I was just going to say, there's also this talk, there was rumors around that he might be pardoning the controversial Sheriff Arpaio down there, and my view is that I think that would be a great way for him to get off message, because I think that would stir up a whole new set of controversies around race and immigration, and coming after this week, that's not exactly the best thing that he needs.
Well, and again, no one can predict what the president will do, because if you did, everybody would say you were crazy. Because there is no way to predict any of it. It is all outrageous, sometimes outrageously great, and sometimes outrageously bad.
It's the Trump reality show. We have to tune in to find out what's going on.
Yeah, stay tuned, everybody. Robert, great to have you here in person. Taylor Maxwell, Brian Darling, thanks so much. I want to turn back